For years, people who were in that studio described this moment as a compliment. It wasn't. It was the spring of 1969, inside a television studio built for a single purpose: to capture, week after week, a half-hour show called This is Tom Jones. A rehearsal was running long. Cameras sat idle on their tracks. Cue cards leaned against amplifier cases. Technicians moved quietly between sets, adjusting flags and gels on lights that wouldn't be needed for hours. And in the middle of the set, under work lights far less forgiving than the ones that would be used for the broadcast, Tom Jones stood across from Aretha Franklin, about to sing with her for the first time. He had been told weeks earlier that she was coming. Producers had mentioned it almost casually, the way they mentioned most bookings. Another name on a list of guests for the season. He had not quite believed it would feel like this. The run-through had been going for almost an hour. The band had played through the arrangement twice already, working out small details. A horn entrance that came in too early, a key change that needed smoothing. Aretha had sung through her parts with the kind of effortless control that made everyone in the room, even people who had worked with her before, stop what they were doing and listen. Stagehands who normally kept moving during rehearsal found themselves standing still near the wings, listening to a voice they had heard 100 times on records suddenly fill the room in person. And then it was Tom's turn. He started strong. His voice had always been his strength, powerful, full, capable of filling a room without a microphone if it had to. But something was different that day. As the song built toward its peak, Tom reached for something extra. A held note stretched longer than written. A vocal run added where the arrangement called for silence. A rasp in his voice that hadn't been there in rehearsal the day before. He was not singing the song the way he usually sang it. He was singing the way he thought Aretha Franklin would want him to sing. The take ended. The band let their instruments settle, and for a moment, nobody in the studio said anything at all. To understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand what Tom Jones was carrying into that room. By 1969, Tom had become one of the biggest names in entertainment. A hit television show, sold-out engagements in Las Vegas, a string of records that had crossed from pop charts into something closer to soul and rhythm and blues. He had grown up in Pontypridd, in a working-class corner of Wales, in a house where the radio played the American records that shaped almost everything he loved about music. Voices like Aretha Franklin's were not background noise in that house. They were the standard. The sound that, as a boy, he had measured his own voice against and found wanting. Those records had crossed an ocean to reach him, carried on late-night radio signals and second-hand singles passed between friends. He had learned to sing, in part, by trying to find that same feeling in his own voice. Not to copy it exactly, but to understand what made it move people the way it did. He had never expected, as a boy in that house, that he would one day stand in a studio and sing across from the person who had made those records. Now, more than a decade later, that same voice was standing a few feet away from him, about to share a song. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes from performing for someone whose work shaped you before you ever had an audience of your own. It is different from stage fright. It is not about the size of the crowd or the cameras. It is about whether the person standing across from you can hear, in your voice, every place where you fell short of the thing that made you want to sing in the first place. Tom had spent years building a stage persona that filled rooms, big, physical, full of presence. But in front of Aretha Franklin, In a half-empty studio with the lights still being adjusted, all of that suddenly felt like it might not be enough. So without quite deciding to, he reached for more. More rasp, more runs, more of what he believed soul music was supposed to sound like, layered on top of what he actually sounded like. Aretha Franklin, by contrast, needed none of that. She had come to the show not as a guest performer playing a smaller role, but as an artist whose presence alone reshaped the room. Musicians who had worked dozens of sessions found themselves playing more carefully when she sang, not because she demanded it, but because her voice made sloppiness audible in a way it usually wasn't. She did not perform louder than the moment required. She did not add anything that wasn't already there. Her power came from precision, from knowing exactly how much of herself a phrase needed, and giving exactly that, no more, no less. It was this quality, more than her range or her power, that had made her one of the most respected voices in American music, the kind of respect that other singers felt the moment she walked into a room, long before she sang a single note. And it was this quality that made Tom's reach for more so audible the moment the take ended. The studio felt the gap immediately, even if no one could have explained it out loud. The director, watching from behind the cameras, said nothing, waiting to see who would speak first. The band stayed quiet, instruments resting on knees and stands. A sound engineer adjusted a dial that didn't need adjusting, just to have something to do with his hands. And then Aretha Franklin looked at Tom Jones and said one sentence. It was quiet. It was not unkind, and it was almost impossible for the people standing nearby to immediately understand what it meant. She said, "You don't have to do that." 4 words, said gently without any edge to them, and the studio went completely still. For the crew watching, it was easy to read those 4 words as a kind of compliment, a way of saying that Tom's voice was already good enough, that he didn't need to push so hard, that he had nothing to prove. Several people in the room would remember it that way for years afterward. Aretha Franklin telling Tom Jones he was already great. But that was not what she meant. Not exactly. What Aretha had heard in that take was not a singer reaching for greatness. It was a singer reaching for her, trying to sound like the records he had grown up with, trying to prove in real time that he belonged in the same category as the voice that had shaped him. And what she was telling him, in the gentlest way she knew how, was that none of that was necessary. Not because his voice was already at her level, but because trying to sound like someone else, even someone he admired, was never going to get him there. It would only ever get him further from the thing that had made his own voice worth hearing in the first place. "You don't have to do that," was not permission. It was a correction, delivered with enough warmth that almost no one in the room recognized it as one. Tom understood it. Not immediately. Not in the way a lesson is understood when someone explains it directly, but in the way a true thing is understood when it lands exactly where it needs to. He didn't respond right away. He looked down at the microphone stand, then back at Aretha, and gave a small nod. Not the nod of someone agreeing to be polite. The nod of someone recalibrating in real time what he was about to do. The director called for another take. The band picked their instruments back up. And this time, when Tom began to sing, something had shifted. He didn't reach for the rasp this time. He didn't add the extra run. He sang the song the way he had sung it for years before that day. Full, direct, unmistakably his own. And without the layer of imitation on top of it, something else became audible that hadn't been there in the first take. The actual quality of his voice. The thing that had made him a star in the first place. The thing that didn't need to borrow from anyone. When the song ended this time, the silence in the room was different. It wasn't the silence of people unsure what they'd just heard. It was the silence of people who had just heard something land exactly where it was supposed to. Aretha didn't say much more about it. She didn't need to. The two of them moved on to working out the harmonies for the broadcast, talking through phrasing and timing the way two professionals do when a song needs to come together for cameras in a few hours. To anyone walking onto the set at that moment, it would have looked like nothing unusual had happened at all. But for the people who had been there for that first take, for the silence after it, and for the 4 words that followed, something had happened that they would talk about for years, even if most of them got the meaning slightly wrong. By the time the cameras rolled for the actual broadcast later that day, there was no visible trace of what had happened in rehearsal. Tom and Aretha walked through their marks, traded a few words off mic that made each other laugh, and stepped into position as the band counted them in. To the studio audience, seated just beyond the lights, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. 2 performers who respected each other, about to share a song. The broadcast itself, when it aired, became one of the most fondly remembered episodes of This Is Tom Jones. Audiences at home had no way of knowing about the rehearsal, no way of hearing the difference between the version of Tom that had almost gone to air and the version that actually did. All they saw was 2 extraordinary voices, clearly at ease with each other, sounding like they had been singing together for years. That ease was real, but it had been earned just hours earlier by 4 quiet words that almost nobody understood the way they were meant. For Tom, the moment became something he carried quietly for the rest of his career, not as a story he told often, but as a kind of internal marker. A reminder of the difference between singing at someone and singing with them. Between trying to prove something and simply being himself, fully, in front of people who could hear the difference, whether they said so or not. Aretha Franklin, for her part, likely never thought of it as a significant moment at all. She had said something true, simply, the way she said most things. It was the kind of correction she might have given without a second thought, the sort of thing that, for most performers, would have passed by unnoticed. But Tom Jones noticed, and in noticing, he became, for the rest of that day's rehearsal and for the broadcast that followed, more fully himself than he had been in the hour before Aretha Franklin said 4 words and the studio went quiet. In the years afterward, Tom would work with many other singers whose voices had shaped him as a young man, sharing stages, trading songs, standing in studios not unlike that one. And more than once, when he felt that same old pull to reach for something that wasn't his, he would think back to that rehearsal room, to 4 quiet words, and let the reach go. Looking back now, it is tempting to remember this story the way the crew first did, as a moment of praise, a great singer telling another great singer he was good enough. It is a more comfortable story that way, easier to repeat. Easier to fit into the version of these 2 performers that history has settled on. 2 legends, easy and equal, sharing a stage. But the real version is quieter than that, and more honest. It is the story of a performer reaching for something that wasn't his, being gently told to put it down, and discovering, in the few seconds it took to start the song again, that what was already his had been enough all along. That is the part of the story that never made it to air, and it is the part, perhaps, that mattered most.